This is Scott Richmond.
And Arnie Sherman.
You're listening to What Do You Know on Newstalk KGVO, AM 1290 and 1015 FM. Good morning, Missoula. Today's a special day for What Do You Know, brought to you in part by Don Maddox, Glacier Sotheby International Realty. My partner, my trusted partner, Arnie Sherman, is not with me today in the studio. He's in Washington, D.C. So, as you know, we record this show, and Arnie and I recorded a lively, wonderful conversation with Brian Gebhardt, who is the general manager of Frontier States for Uber. So we are going to join that conversation that we had in progress. But I wanted to give you a quick update on what's going on. Uber came to Montana and to Missoula specifically in August of this year. And Missoula was probably, or is probably, the fastest growing market for Uber in Montana. There has been such a high adoption rate and usage rate of Uber, either folks that are signing up to be drivers and to earn extra income being drivers in Missoula and western Montana, as well as passengers and people taking advantage of the service. And so we're seeing great adoption for Uber, and I'm not surprised. I am from the East Coast, as you know, and Uber and Lyft and other on-demand services have been around for a couple of years now, and the usage rate and adoption rate in those cities and markets has been nothing short of phenomenal. So it's nice to see that Missoula is actually participating and actively involved. Conversation with Brian is actually really a great fact-finding mission, and we're going to find out a lot about who's using Uber, why they're using it, what Uber's plans are for the future, what new technologies they have in development that are helping to grow the company, how Montanans are taking to the product, and just a very good, lively conversation. So anyway, when we come back, we'll be joined by Brian Gebhardt, GM, Uber, Frontier States. Back after this. We are back on What Do You Know on Newstalk KGVO. Our guest is Brian Gebhardt from Uber, and Arnie, my trusted partner, is on the phone from Washington, D.C. So
we're very high-tech here. I'm in D.C., you're in Missoula. Brian, where are you?
I'm actually sitting in Seattle, Washington right now.
So look at that, 3 different parts of the country. Brian, Uber's in 66 countries. You're in 500 cities. How did Montana get on this map?
Well, you know, one thing we're trying to do with Uber is make sure that we provide that reliability across, as many geographies as possible. And so, Montana being a very large and growing state, we definitely wanted to make sure and look for opportunities there. And so we launched a couple months ago, and it's going great.
In what cities?
So our original launch was in 6 different cities. We started in Missoula across a week doing a rolling launch. We went to Missoula, then Great Falls. We then went to Helena, Butte, Bozeman, and Billings. And but as we were moving, we were also turning on rural parts of the state as well. So if drivers want to sign up to be on the Uber platform in less populated towns, they're definitely able to do that, and they can provide rides to riders in those areas.
Hey, Brian.
How would the people in those smaller towns know? Are you planning to advertise in those markets?
Yeah, we're not quite there yet. We're still focused a lot on growing our business in those larger cities that I mentioned, but we will definitely get the word out as time goes on to try to make sure that riders are aware.
And you're responsible for all of Montana?
I am, yes.
And how long have you been with the company?
I've been with the company for just over 7 months. I also have responsibility for Idaho, remote Washington, Wyoming, and Alaska.
And so how are you finding the experience? I mean, you're new to the company. The company's relatively new, right? I mean, it launched in 2009, and it's a typical startup with $200,000 in seed capital, and then it kind of went on a very upward trajectory, another $1.25 million invested in 2010, and then $44 million in 2011, and then from there Google and Toyota and Baidu in China all invested. And last year you did $1.5 billion, got 6,700 employees. How do you find working there in Seattle?
It's a lot of fun. It's as you can imagine, very fast paced, right? With all the the growth that you just referenced. There's always something new. It seems like every morning when we come to the office. So it's been a really dynamic and enjoyable experience, and it hasn't slowed down since the day I started, I can tell you that.
It's beautiful. And Arnie, the interesting thing about Brian is that Brian is a Montanan. So, Brian, tell us where you're from.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in a small town called Roundup, which is about 50 miles north of Billings. And I grew up stacking lumber at my dad's sawmill there in the small town of Roundup.
Wow. So, and how did you actually get to Uber? Where were you prior to?
Yeah, absolutely. So I came immediately prior from a startup that operated in Denver, Colorado. But before that was at a lot of different places. I actually left Montana after high school to go to West Point, so I spent several years in the Army, and then got an MBA and bounced around from strategy consulting to a few years with Hewlett-Packard, and then went to that startup I mentioned.
So you've always been were you in the Bay Area for the most part?
I've been all over the place, everywhere from Texas to Colorado to Iraq in the Army, back to Massachusetts, Texas, Colorado, and then, now working out of the Seattle office here with Uber.
Arnie, very interesting. Brian's partner in crime, a guy named Alex Diaz, who runs marketing for the same region, spent a lot of time overseas. He's an Army brat and spent a lot of time in Japan and Korea and places in between. And he's based out of Seattle, as is Brian.
And Brian, you guys have a military program, don't you?
We do, yeah, absolutely. We have what's called Uber Military, and the goal there is to sign up both military family members, especially spouses, as well as veterans. And what we found is that it's a really great program for transitioning veterans who are just leaving the service and not quite sure what they want to do full-time. And, right. Driving with Uber provides them an opportunity to make a few dollars while they figure out what they want to do next and really, focus their efforts after that.
So let me ask a question. So you've been in Montana for a couple of months now. You're in most of our major cities. How's it going, and what markets are performing, let's say, more are better than others?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. So, you wouldn't be probably too surprised to hear that the college towns tend to do the best, especially immediately after launch, because there's a great market to be had there with college students who are, out doing a lot of different things. They need safe rides. And so we've seen a lot of success, especially in Missoula and Bozeman, but we've also seen, great success in the other cities as well. And then, I guess beyond the college aspect, it tends to be very closely correlated with population. So you can imagine, the larger populations tend to have more of a demand for rides than the smaller populations do.
How many drivers do you have signed up in Missoula?
Yeah, we don't give specific information on cities, but I can tell you that we have hundreds of drivers signed up across the state of Montana.
That's impressive.
And do you have a lot of demand in each of these big markets, like people looking for rides?
We do, yeah. And so we typically measure demand in number of rides in the thousands over the course of a month. So you can imagine, how that breaks out amongst the cities. It's pretty robust. We're very happy with what we've seen since we started a couple months ago.
Is the Montana profile of users similar to users in other states, or is there anything particularly unique about the Montana customer?
We've seen a lot of interest to and from various events, right? So if you think of a large venue that might have a concert or, a Grizz football game, for example, at Washington Grizzly Stadium, we see a lot of demand for those sorts of things. And then we also, along the lines of the college demographic, and then some folks that may not be in college, but they still like to go out and have fun with their friends on the weekends. Obviously, there's a huge demand for safe rides. So we see a lot of a very high demand during those weekend night hours that you could expect to see from that.
And what do
you spend most of your time doing, Brian, as a GM representing multiple states? What does your typical day look like when you show up at Uber headquarters?
That's a really great question. It seems like no 2 days are the same. To broadly answer the question, there's a mixed balance of what we call it demand, which is making sure that we're getting as many riders on the platform as possible and letting them know about the services we provide, as well as helping them understand additional use cases where we can provide safe rides. So it could be, a person has used the service for a ride home from, an evening out, and then we're educating them on the idea that they could also use it after watching a Grizz football game or something along those lines. And so that's on the demand side. The other piece, as far as the marketplace itself, is the supply side, and so that's going to be getting the word out to drivers and making sure that we sign up as many driver partners as possible to be on the platform and to provide that service to the riders, especially when the demand is the highest in those areas that we talked about before. And then the other piece that is kind of interesting and nuanced for Uber general managers is the public affairs side of things. And while we have great support from a public affairs team here at Uber, I also find myself meeting with public officials a lot, just to either A, answer questions that they have, or B, make sure that we're addressing any issues that come up.
Sure. And in that capacity, I mean, it would be no surprise to our listeners that Uber has had some controversy, and there have been, protests, and clearly from, the taxi cab industry, domestically and internationally, there has, been concerns about competition and all those things. And do you find yourself immersed in that as well?
To some degree, yes. But, generally speaking, we try to stay focused on the areas where we can really move the needle, which is making sure that we educate riders and drivers and try to, expand the platform that way. However, when questions like that do come up, of course, I'm available to address them and answer them for folks.
Well, it's interesting when you think about a market like Missoula, for instance. For a long time, folks have felt very underserved by the existing taxi cab setup and mass transit's there, but it was never, schedules are such that they're not as frequent. So for a number of years, we've been lobbying to get Uber-like type, setups here. So have you seen a velocity of adoption in Missoula kind of quicker or faster than other markets, or is it about the same?
I would not to be too specific, but the general trend is that Missoula has been a very strong market for us, especially at those when you might expect, right? The problem with the traditional taxi services is you have a very limited supply of them, right? So you might have 5 or 10 cabs for a smaller city that can provide, they work as hard as they can to provide rides when that demand is there for those rides. But what you see is everyone wants a ride at the same time, right? And so at 1:45 a.m. on a Friday night / Saturday morning,
right.
The demand for rides is much higher than what those 5 or 10 cabs can provide. And the great thing about Uber is, since it's a lot of folks who just work part-time to supplement their income using their own personal vehicles as independent contractors, we can get the word out to those folks and say, hey, there's a great opportunity for you to earn a lot of money from the riders that are out there. If you're on the platform during these hours, and so
great demand, because I know, I've used it, for the early morning, the 5:40 flight out of the airport, or the flight that gets in, the last flight of the night that gets in midnight.
Right. Absolutely.
Yep.
Hey, Arnie. Yep. Let's do a quick ID. You're listening to What Do You Know on Newstalk KGVO, presented by Don Maddox, Glacier Sotheby International Realty. Our guest is Brian Gebhardt, GM of, the Pacific Northwest Markets? Is that is that your title, Brian?
We actually call it the Frontier States. It doesn't include the larger cities in the Pacific Northwest,
okay.
like Portland and
the
Seattle.
Ones that used to be served by Pony Express is now being served by Uber.
And my partner Arnie's on the phone. Arnie, another question.
Sure. So do you communicate on a daily basis with your drivers? Do you give them updates is there ongoing interaction with corporate?
There is. So we typically send out a weekly summary of information that helps them plan their week and determine when they want to be on the platform and provide those rides. And then beyond that, we also provide phone-in appointments where they can get their questions answered if they're seeing any sort of issues. And the last thing that we do is we try to do driver focus groups. We do those a little bit less frequently because we're not on the ground sort of every day or even every week. But, once a month to once a quarter, somewhere along those lines, we're typically getting together with a small group of drivers and trying to get as much feedback from them as possible so that we can, improve their experience and make them successful on the platform.
I've used Uber often, and I always ask the drivers, how they like working for the company, how long they've been doing it, how many hours do they put. I'm just curious about the model, and I, generally get very, good responses about that. Also about how, the software works and how quickly they get compensated, how quickly the money actually ends up in their accounts, and those sort of things. So, I mean, this is, it's an age-old service, from in time immemorial, somebody providing taxi service or limousine service or transportation service, and you put it on a new platform that allows this kind of interaction. What other kind of advances are you looking at corporately?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there are a number of different things we're trying to do to sort of revolutionize the transportation world, whether that's safety features such as understanding a little bit more about your driver when he or she comes to pick you up in terms of sort of their star rating and their a lot of information about their vehicle, the license plate, the make and the model, those sorts of things. The ability to share your route and your destination to anyone who is, it may be expecting you on the other end at your destination, all the way to your own ability to rate that driver after you've, had the ride take place. So there are things that we're doing with that on the safety side of things. On the information side of things, arming those drivers with that information that allows them to be as successful as possible, both, personally for themselves as well as, providing a very reliable service for the riders that, things that didn't exist just 10 years ago with where technology was at that point.
Sure. Are you experimenting corporately with driverless cars?
Yeah, there is some information that's available. I personally don't have a lot of info on that because that hasn't been my focus. But Uber as a company has invested in the autonomous vehicle space, the self-driving car space, and most of that activity is actually happening in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania right now.
Let me ask you a question. So, Uber for transportation, but let's talk about the on-demand economy. And, where does this model work, and what other categories does the on-demand economy work? I know you're looking at food service delivery in certain markets. What are other areas of growth?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think anytime there is a demand for something that can be, where the delivery model can be adjusted and made to be digital, there's this ability for an on-demand service. And so there are a lot of opportunities in the on-demand space, even way beyond what Uber is doing, right? And so I think, we focused here on the ride-sharing space. You just referenced food delivery, which Uber has also dove headfirst into over the past several months with Uber Eats. But there are a whole host of others as well. I mean, you think of Netflix.
Right.
In the past, there was no sort of on-demand opportunity for someone to get a movie, right? You had to get a cable subscription, or you'd go to the movie theater, or you could potentially go rent a video from a video store, bring it home back to your house. Well, now the internet has completely changed that. So, any way where you could digitize the delivery model and change it up that way and provide that service in a way that it hasn't been previously provided, there's an opportunity for the on-demand economy to be relevant.
Yeah, sure. And then from a technology standpoint, I'm imagining that your developers are feverishly at work looking for new platforms, new opportunities to build your product. Talk to us a little bit about the investment that Uber is making in technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what you'll see, especially, if you looked at online job boards and those sorts of things, Uber's doing a tremendous amount of hiring, especially in some of their technology hubs, in areas of software engineering, other various different, functions, things like that. There's still a lot of opportunity for innovation in the transportation space. Everything from the ride-sharing that business line that we're in to to the food delivery side, which you referenced before, to several others that I'm not at liberty to mention right now, but that are sort of, in the works as potential future business lines that you can maybe expect to see from Uber at some point in the future.
And what's interesting about it is that, I could tell when you guys redid, I guess it's iterative. They're always improving upon their apps, Arnie.
Exactly.
And I can tell, like, when, back in the day when I first started using Uber to now, it's night and day, and it's just so much better now. And I'm imagining you guys have profitability models to be able to determine what this improvement did to actually shorten the time of wait, shorten the time of hailing, a driver, and overall profitability.
Absolutely. And, the two things that we really try to think about are, number one, what is the customer experience like? And number two, how can we provide that most reliable ride at that, cheapest price for that rider? And obviously, if we can get those two pieces right, both the drivers and the riders will have a great experience, and
what
we will be a
training do you have now for drivers?
The question is, what kind of training? What the question was, what kind of training do you have for drivers?
Yeah, so because drivers are independent contractors, we don't have a specific training regimen per se. But what we try to do is provide as much information as possible via our website that allows them to, understand, all the different information relative to how to use the Uber driver app and be on the platform, as well as some specific information about how to be successful driving within the city that they reside.
Right, and is that the same protocol you use internationally?
Sorry, repeat it, please.
Was it the same protocol you use internationally to train drivers?
Yeah, I think you're going to see nuances, right? Just based on the business climate in certain countries, the legal and regulatory frameworks that are in place in countries, which can be slightly different. But generally speaking, Uber driver partners are independent contractors, and so we try to be mindful of that and set up the information in such a way that it empowers them, while it still makes clear that relationship between them and Uber as independent contractors.
And Arnie, I want to ask another question with respect to the on-demand economy, because I think what's interesting about Uber is that there's a feedback loop. So, the drivers and the passengers are always rating each other. So
that's exactly right.
Right.
So this on-demand,
that's important.
It's incredibly important because it really rewards those that do a great job, and those that are kind of mediocre, I guess it kind of moves them to the middle or to the bottom of the list, both drivers and passengers. Correct?
It does. And then the other interesting thing is, if a driver consistently provides a great service to riders, that opens up additional opportunities in some cities within Uber for other product groups that we have as well. And so, specific to that, there are opportunities for some of those drivers in those cities. Beyond that, if ratings fall below a certain threshold for a driver partner, we will intervene and, reach out to that driver partner, take them off the platform momentarily while we help them, link them up with maybe it's a defensive driving course or other sorts of things like that to help them increase that rating and make it a better experience for the rider. But by all means, that feedback mechanism is extremely important to the service that we provide.
That's actually incredible. Arnie, think about that for other like, if I need front desk help here at the radio station and I need a temp service.
Yeah, well, it obviously has applications,
right,
in other service industries. But I want to get back to something I mentioned in the lead into the show, which Brian didn't have a chance to hear. For me personally, and for a number of people that I work with who are, internationally focused business people who travel to Europe and China and other regions of the world, one of the great value-added services of Uber is the ability to use this service in a market where you're not familiar with the language, you're not familiar with all of the local nuances, and you use the same system you would use here, putting in your destination,
right,
seeing the picture of the driver and knowing what the price is, and not having to have local currency in your pocket. All of those things makes that entry and exit from a foreign market much more palatable. I know many people who cringe and have anxiety about having to arrive, and what are they going to do at the airport to get to their hotel, and what are they going to do from their hotel or from wherever they're staying if they're using an Airbnb or VRBO. How are they going to go from there back to the airport? And this alleviates that whole problem.
Without question.
Yeah, it does. And, one of the things I mentioned at the beginning when we talked about how do we make it to Montana is really we want to provide that reliable service across the world. And so you're starting to see that, right? Smaller states in the United States, smaller countries across the world, things like that. And you nailed one of the most important things, which is that consistency of experience regardless of where it is that you're trying to use Uber.
What's the Uber experience now in China? You can use Uber in China?
Yeah, so I'm sure folks are somewhat aware of the news that's been released over the past few months regarding the merger of Uber China with Didi. And so basically what that means is you can still use the Uber app to take a ride in China, but as time goes on, those rides will start to be provided by Didi based on the merger. I think that there's a whole separate conversation that could be had on that. But suffice it to say, at this point, you're still going to have that same consistent Uber experience in China as well.
What's been the toughest market for Uber to break into, domestic or foreign? Where's been the toughest place to get a foothold?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, there were certainly challenges with China. We oftentimes see regulatory hurdles. We've experienced those all over the world in various countries as well as, states or provinces. And then the other piece is obviously the competitive side. Some environments are fiercely competitive while others are a little bit less competitive. I think, with China, you saw both a very competitive environment as well as, at least early on, a regulatorily challenging environment as well. But I feel like, we did a good job as a company to overcome those hurdles, and I feel like
I know from spending time, for example, in Italy, there's a very rigid taxi cab pecking order in places like Milan or in Naples. And you have any idea? I know you work in the frontier states. You have any idea what the experience has been like in a place like Italy?
Italy specifically, I do not, and I apologize for not knowing.
That's okay.
But I will say, just across Europe, we do tend to see a different environment than what we would see in the U.S.
Yeah, and are there what qualifies a new? You're in 60+ countries, right? At this point. And there's 200 countries.
Yeah.
How do you decide what's the next kind of frontier for you guys? What's the next country to get into?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we have a management structure in place and a team dedicated to developing markets that is constantly assessing all those different.
What's going on?
Sorry, what was that?
Did you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. No, we've been joined in our studio by Alex Diaz, and I'm trying to get him plugged in to hear the conversation. Keep going, Arnie.
Okay. Yeah, so we have a team that's dedicated to developing markets, and so they're constantly assessing where those opportunities lie across the world, and sort of rank ordering where the next best place would be, as well as assessing the readiness for that market to. For the Uber product, as it were.
Sure. And what's kind of the mix in terms of male versus female drivers? I've had both, but corporate-wise, what does it look like?
Good question. I actually don't know the up-to-date numbers on that, but I will say that in the most recent numbers I have seen, we have a very strong female representation amongst our driver partners. Significantly more than what I've seen in other in taxis, for example. This is based on the United States. I can't speak for, other countries and things like that. But a very strong representation of females, and obviously a strong representation for male driver partners as well.
Perfect.
So for those listeners who want to become an Uber driver, what do they need to do, and how does it work once they're selected or once they're part of the team?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's a lot of information that can be had just by going to uber.com/drive. But the general onboarding process is for a driver to fill out some information on himself or herself, as well as his or her vehicle. And as long as it's 12 years old or newer, has 4 doors and at least 4 seats, it needs to go through a 19-point safety inspection. The driver also needs to have a driver's license, proof of registration on that vehicle, and proof of personal insurance. And then there's a 7-year background check that happens for that driver after he or she provides that information on himself or herself. That background check looks at federal, state, and county crime databases as well as the National Sex Offender Registry, and looks for any huge red flags that would disqualify them from, being able to provide those rides on the Uber platform.
Sure. Hey, well, let's do a quick ID, Arnie. You're listening to What Do You Know on Newstalk KGVO. Our guest is Brian Gebhardt, the general manager of Uber, the Frontier States, and we are presented by Don Maddox, Glacier Sotheby's International Realty. Quick question for you, Brian. I know you mentioned that some of the work you do as a general manager is working with the community and working with leaders and local leaders. One of the interesting things about what's going on in Missoula is that you guys have struck a relationship with the University of Montana. And as well as, and that's how I know you guys, you're working with us on the DUI task force as well. And just would like you to speak a little bit about that, both of those topics.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of our big pillars that we try to do wherever we enter a market is provide, the safe roads and safety within that marketplace. And so as it pertains to the city of Missoula, obviously a tremendous opportunity to work in partnership with the Missoula DUI Task Force as well as the University of Montana to try to identify as many opportunities for and provide those safe rides, or at least facilitate those safe rides for students as well as residents within the city of Missoula, and make the roads a little bit safer. We talked a little bit before about the times of the week, late night on the weekends that can be most effective and important, and we focused on those. But then, you see it with Grizzlies football games as well. And so we try to do as much as we can, and we try to do that in all the cities that we operate as well.
That's great. It's also interesting is that, that's just scratching the surface in a market like Missoula or a Bozeman, where you have a lot of folks that work with different civic organizations, whether it be the Travel and Visitors and Travels Bureau, the DUI Task Force, the Chamber of Commerce. You guys are really thrusting yourself into the community. You want to be an important part of the community. Is that kind of the mission statement of Uber?
Yeah, the idea of Uber is, safe and reliable transportation, as reliable as running water. And so, absolutely, in order to provide that reliability, in order to be there, facilitating those safe rides whenever they're needed, it's incumbent upon us to work with as many stakeholders as possible. So everything from local elected officials to local chambers of commerce to local universities, DUI task forces, et cetera. There are lots of different opportunities to do that, and we try to do as much as possible, in each of those markets, depending on what stakeholders there are that are active in those areas.
Do the demographics of users vary by region of the country in terms of age and male versus female, that sort of thing? Or do you have what's a prototypical sort of profile of a user?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wouldn't say that there's really a gender aspect to it. We see a lot of demand from both males and females on our platform across the United States. The age tends to be a bit younger, right? In order to request a ride, you need to do so typically on your mobile device. There is a way to do so on a computer, but very few rides that we have requests that are done that way. And so in order to request the ride on your mobile device, that means you have to have installed the application on that device and signed up for an account, all those sorts of things that tend to lend themselves a little bit more so to a younger audience.
Interesting. How about on the driver's side?
The drivers is going to be it's a little bit more varied. When you start to look at different cities, different markets that we're in,
right?
The split tends to be a little bit different from a standpoint of, in some cities you see a lot of former taxi drivers, and others you do not. The split between full-time versus part-time tends to be different in some cities versus others. And then just beyond that, it could be some folks that are between jobs and just want to do something temporarily versus they just want to make a little bit of extra money so that they can take their family on vacation versus folks that say, I'm going to do this full time. So that part does vary a little bit more.
Is there a minimum amount of time a driver has to put in per week or per month?
Absolutely not. That is completely up to the driver partner. I mentioned earlier in the discussion that they're all independent contractors, so it's 100% up to them as to how much time they want to spend on the platform and when they want to do it. In some cases, actually, in some of the like in Arizona and other places where you see sort of the snowbird vacation trending and things like that, we see folks that only drive during the wintertime, don't drive at all during, the other sort of 7 to 8 months of the year. And then once wintertime rolls back around, they go back down to Arizona or Nevada or, wherever they spend those months, and they get back on the platform again. And that's completely up to them.
What about on the other extreme? Is there a maximum amount of time? I mean, do you track your drivers in terms of, how much time they're putting in and whether once they become a driver, whether they've gotten, a speeding ticket or a DUI or any of that?
We do have certain things that we track. We obviously want to make sure that, for example, they're not driving so many hours that it becomes a safety risk and those sorts of things. So we're obviously able to track which hours they are actively logged into the platform, as well as the number of hours that they have spent actively providing rides just based on the technology. One of the other interesting things the technology provides is via telematic data. We can see how fast they're accelerating or how fast they're slowing down, those sorts of things, and we can let them know that, hey, this is a bit out of the tolerance of what we would expect for someone who's driving safely, those sorts of things. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff. We talked earlier about technology. There's a lot of interesting stuff that we can look at.
Scott, you could use that for your kids.
I know, definitely, at least one of them. Well, interesting to note that, I'm just looking at personal experience here in Missoula. Of the people that are driving for Uber, and there's about 4 people I know, they tend to be 35-plus female head of households who are doing it part-time to supplement their income. Is that a common kind of trend you see in markets like Missoula and places like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could segment the driver partner base a number of different ways, but no matter how you slice it up, that is one of the segments that we often see is exactly what you just described. We also would see that similar segment that, aren't just females, but males as well. Folks that are head of household and trying to make a little extra money for their family.
So if somebody's driving in, let's say, what's the biggest city in your frontier market territory?
Boise, Idaho.
So if somebody's a driver in Boise and is putting in 40 to 50 hours a week, the equivalent of a typical full-time job, what could somebody like that, expect to earn during a normal week?
Yeah, it's a good question. The earnings actually vary significantly based on, what parts of the city that person's driving in, which times of the week that person's driving as well. It's hard to give you a specific answer because it's such a wide range. But the hourly bookings can be, anywhere from on the low end, if it's not extremely busy, down around $10 to $15 an hour. all the way up to the extremely busy times where it could be in excess of $30 an hour. So,
and that's their cut
can just
of the fare, right?
Up.
Because obviously Uber is in this to make money, and they take a percentage of each of the fares, right?
That's correct. So, I mean, I think the numbers I provided could be either net of the service fee that Uber takes as a result of that transaction, or could be inclusive of it. The numbers really do vary a lot depending on, are there local events that are going on, and is the driver partner driving during those hours?
Sure.
All those
and
sorts of
the
things.
drivers are responsible for their own, obviously their own gas and oil and, servicing their vehicle, correct?
That's exactly right. As independent contractors, they're responsible
Upkeep.
for
You know what's interesting is that Uber's also very aggressive and in a good way in acquisition marketing. So they're offering discounts and promotions and different ways for people to try the service, because I guess the perspective is once you try it, you're hooked. You're going to see this as a viable means of either earning an income or traveling around where you live.
Yes, that is exactly right. And so there are a number of different things that Uber does to try to provide that incentive for folks to try the service out. One of those is that any riders can provide a promotion code to their friends that allows the friend to take their first ride free up to a certain threshold, and then provides a free ride for the person who does the referring, also free up to a certain threshold. So, we're experimenting with a lot of different things like that, both on the rider and driver side.
Beautiful. Hey, Arnie.
Do all of the drivers in all of the markets have a decal now in their vehicles to identify them as Uber cars?
It depends on the market, to be 100% frank with you. So, within each city and or state, there are different regulatory frameworks. Some of those regulatory frameworks require those decals. Mm-hmm. In that case, you would find them on the car wherever the regulation requires. In others, it's not required, but Uber still tries to promote that as a means for easy pairing of drivers and riders once a ride has been requested and accepted.
Because I've used the Uber where there's been both, and obviously for most of the users, the simplest way is to just remember the last couple of numbers of the license plate. And so I usually track it down, particularly when I'm using it. In most cases, it's at a busy location. It's at an airport, or it's a hotel, or it's an event with a lot of cars going by, and it's easier to pick up the license plate.
Exactly. Well, Arnie, we're actually
that's right.
Sorry about that, Brian. We're actually butting up to a break, and in our final 3 minutes, we're going to come back with Brian Gebhardt, General Manager, Frontier States for Uber, and we'll ask him some final questions. We'll be back right after this. We're back on What Do You Know, Newstalk KGVO. Our guest is Brian Gebhardt, General Manager, Frontier States, Uber, and we are presented by Don Maddox, Glacier Sotheby's International Realty. Arnie.
Brian, one of the things I forgot to ask you about is driver insurance. What's the requirements for a driver in terms of coverage?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because there's been a little bit of confusion on this topic. And so, one of the items I mentioned when drivers sign up to be partners with Uber on the platform is that they have a personal insurance coverage. That's just to ensure insurability for that driver. But there has been some confusion around what insurance Uber provides. And Uber provides a very comprehensive commercial policy that includes up to $1 million in coverage while a ride is taking place, as well as coverage that happens even before a ride has been accepted and is in progress. And so it's there have been a lot of potential concerns that some folks have had on that, and I think the general theme here is there shouldn't be a concern on that. The policy that Uber provides is very robust.
And is that policy also good for when the driver doesn't have passengers?
Yeah, so the coverage levels are a little bit different, but I think the important point to remember is that there is coverage no matter where where in the process the driver is. As long as they're logged into the application and available to provide rides, there is coverage.
Okay, got it.
So in the past, there's been a little bit of confusion about, when there's not a ride in progress, but the driver partner is logged into the application. Just be 100% clear. There is coverage provided by Uber during that time.
Well, good. So with Halloween coming up, the trick-or-treat season, my understanding is you have a little treat for our listeners in terms of, a special offer. What would that be for our Halloween season?
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm really glad you asked. So one of the things we want to do is get as many people to try out the service as possible. And so for all those riders who haven't before used Uber and haven't taken a ride on the platform, you can enter the promotion code Montana Uber, and that provides $20 off on your first ride on the platform. So want to get as many people riding safe on Halloween as possible using that promo code.
That's great. $20, you almost get you to Butte. Hey, Brian, it's been great having you on the phone. I know this has been a telephony experience, having us in 3 different places, but I think it worked out great, and we appreciate you coming on the air with us.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's been a great opportunity to provide some information and answer questions, and I really do appreciate it. So thank you very much.
All right. You've been a great guest, Brian. Arnie, great having you in from Washington, D.C.
Yeah, see you next week.
We'll see you next week. And, folks, this is What Do You Know on Newstalk KGVO. We'll be back next week with Nick Chakota from the Wilma and the Top Hat. See you next week, Arnie.
Take care. Bye-bye, guys.
Thank you for listening to What Do You Know?
I can't wait for the next show, Scott.
I'm excited too, Arnie. If you'd like to suggest a guest, send me an email at scottrichmond@townsquaremedia.com. We'll see you next week. And thanks for listening to Newstalk KGVO, AM 1290, 101.5 FM, and newstalkkgvo.com.